Security researchers remind us to gird our hypervisor loins to avoid ransomware attacks. The security community totally botches a critical React vulnerability by not naming it Reactor Meltdown. Log4Shell is as old as my grandpa now, but the vulnerability was still downloaded 40 million times in 2025. The NCSC is worried that we're treating prompt injection like SQL injection. But we would never do that though, right? And I know you're going to be shocked to hear that AI-enabled IDEs have some serious vulnerabilities that can be exploited via prompt injection. It's a good thing we don't have to worry about that, though, because we use prepared statements, right? All of this and some Your Mom jokes coming up next. Welcome to episode 333 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Kalat.
Good afternoon, evening, morning, whatever it may be to you, Mr. Bell. How are you, sir?
I'm awesome. How are you?
Good. We're getting dangerously close to the holidays, and that comes with its own stresses and, on top of the work stresses.
Yeah, it's been challenging, at least for me. I don't know about for you, to find a chance to record, because it seems like every time I feel like I'm gonna get into the zone to get ready, I've got some Christmas tree to move or something to hang on the door or whatever.
Tis true.
Tis the season. So I hope everybody's having good end of the year. I know this is either a quiet time or a super busy time. There seems to be no kind of in between, right? I know for me, I've picked up some consulting gigs, and my observation is everybody's trying to get lots of stuff done before the end of the year. And I suspect part of that's because like I'm an expense item. And so they want to book that, you book that expense before the year is up. So it's good to know that I can help them.
It's just a line on a spreadsheet.
Just it's all my life has come down to. It's just a line on a spreadsheet. That's right.
I think Bob Seger had a song about this. I'm not a number, I'm a man. For you youngins, you'll have to look that one up.
Yeah, sadly, there was no Metallica cover of that one. But anyway, so changing subjects a bit, I do want to say thank you to our Patreon sponsors. Thank you very, very, very much for sticking with us. Your generosity is very much appreciated. And by the way, if you do want to support the podcast, because we do this without sponsors, right? This is not. I mean, we certainly have like Bob's bait and dial up, right? But that money went pretty fast.
I'm looking for the next Funk Defender sponsorship spot. I'll reach out to him.
Okay. All right. Good. But anyway, we put a lot of time and effort into this, and spend a lot of our own personal money. If you would like to sponsor us, you can do so on our Patreon site. It's patreon.com/defensivesec. And in return, you will have the high privilege, dare I say the high honor, of listening to our episodes a week before everybody else. The literal millions of other listeners, you will be so far ahead.
So in all seriousness, I echo Jerry's thanking our generous donors. Thank you. You guys are awesome. Also, in all seriousness, we've contemplated some other options, but nobody seems to really reached out, like doing like a live call once a month, but nobody really wants to talk to us. They just want to hear what we have to say. They don't actually care about us.
They just want something on in the background. I feel like it probably keeps people away.
The CIA closing all their black sites really did hurt our numbers.
It is true. Although, depending on what happens in Venezuela, there may be a new market.
Getting dangerously close to politics.
Maybe a new market. Anyhow.
Hey, have you mentioned that our thoughts and opinions are ours and not our employers?
That's very true.
Before he runs to HR.
Good call out. Well, HR just left. His tail was up. So anyway. Yep. He's a cutie, though.
What? Are we talking about a cat?
We are talking about a cat. Noki. Noki's the HR department here.
I didn't realize that. Noki is adorable. I did not realize Noki was also HR.
Everybody's got to have a job. Anyway, I think we've bored people to tears. So let's go ahead and get into some stories. The first one of which comes from the Register. And the title here is Researchers Spot 700% Increase in Hypervisor Ransomware Attacks. I thought this was already a pretty common trend. I have talked in the past about how this was something I observed falling a lot of my suppliers when I was back at my prior job. So I think this has been a thing for a while, but it looks like there's actually a pretty recent significant surge. And in this particular article, this is, I think, from Huntress, is saying that primarily due to Akira, they're seeing a huge uptick in in attacks on hypervisors. And it kind of makes sense. We've talked about this in the past, but it kind of makes sense because hypervisors are not as configurable as as traditional operating systems or traditional applications, and you can't run CrowdStrike or Sentinel-1 on VMware, I guess. But then again, who can afford VMware anymore, right? I
Look,
digress.
if you've got VMware, it's probably unpatched, which is a bigger problem.
That's very true. So one thing I think is important to delineate, is that something else has to happen because I'm not going to say never happens, right? But not a lot of organizations have their hypervisor, have the ability to connect into their hypervisor straight from the internet. So typically something else has to happen, right? And often it's a VPN appliance or RDP or what have you. And typically what happens is that the hypervisor is set up to rely on my favorite thing, right? Active Directory authentication. The adversary is able to, through various traditional means, collect credentials for administrative accounts that allows them to connect into the hypervisor. And there's a lot of advantages to that. Like in addition to not having some of the traditional security software like EDR, it also typically doesn't have super mature monitoring on it. Like it's not common, at least, according to this article, it's not common to see hypervisors instrumented to the point where you would be able to see that someone is connected to the hypervisor and is getting ready to launch a ransomware attack.
Yeah, I agreed on all points, and it is just interesting how we see these spikes and these cycles around different types of technology as different threat actors get better at it and they find a methodology that works and a playbook that works. But there are often a lot of hardening guides out there for these hypervisors. And that's one thing I would strongly recommend is people should be finding those and following them, whether it's CIS benchmarks for some of them or the vendors themselves put out hardening guides. And I think that could go a long way towards stopping the most common problems. But you've got to keep up on that. You've got to do it on a regular basis because often features change, functionality changes, attack patterns change, and methodologies for protecting it may change. And new and interesting capabilities may exist. I also agree with you, though, that logging stuff out to a SIM or whatnot is usually pretty nascent on these. Hopefully it'll get better. But I think most people don't look at it from this angle. I almost get the feeling like a lot of IT shops feel that hypervisors are just not targets. And we know that obviously that's not the case, which could be another reason why we're seeing such an uptick in them being popped.
I think that most security programs, this is just from my experience, my observation, is focused on the tenants on top of the hypervisor, right? That's where their focus is, where the risk is viewed, right? They're seeing that is what's primarily exposed, and therefore that's where they're going to apply their protections. But I think the adversaries are finding it easy. It's kind of one-stop shopping. Once they get into your environment, they can do a lot of damage, especially if the preponderance of your infrastructure is running on top of hypervisors. They don't have to do a whole lot of lateral movement. They can kind of get get you all encrypted up in one fell swoop. And so it's convenient for them. I mean, certainly what you said is important. They talk about the importance of adopting things like multi-factor authentication, but one thing I don't see a lot talked a lot about, especially in this day and age of zero trust, right, is the idea of segmentation. Why do you have the ability for, a threat actor to connect from your general network to the management port, the management interface of your hypervisor?
because it's
That's
convenient.
why I know it's convenient for the threat actor. Absolutely.
Look, man, firewalls are new. They've only been around for about 60 years. I'm giving them time to bake.
They are risky. No two ways about it.
No, honestly, to not be snarky about it, I agree with you, but I think IT and security teams have been, frankly, run so lean that they don't often have the opportunity to do that kind of like best practices and segment and isolate and limit traffic. I think they're just barely keeping their head above water with building out infrastructure. And also, this stuff's usually being built out by non-security folks, and security is sometimes not anywhere near the conversation.
It seems like a good opportunity for, a design pattern that is, both effective in terms of mitigating, if all else fails, right, mitigating a threat actor's ability to connect to your management board, but also be somewhat lightweight. And so I don't know what that would look like. Maybe it's, again, relying on switch ports or firewall rules or what have you. It seems like there's got to be a middle ground where we can do a better job, but not materially add to the workload. But I mean, you're right. Like, intuitively, you're right. That's how we're seeing it. Like, it's not accidental. I suspect that it's not, people aren't wanting to be careless or not thorough. It's just they don't have time.
Yep. And it's unfortunate because I think it's stuff like this that does make a difference in defending a
Yeah.
breach, but it's also tough to prove that it makes a difference. How do you prove the negative? How do I prove the amount of breaches I stopped by having a good design?
It's very difficult. Absolutely. But, it's on the uptick, and the basics aren't changing. Like, we're not seeing a move because, I mean, let's be honest, right? I think EDR and XDR and all the star DRs have radically changed security programs, kind of like how ransomware has transformed security programs. I think EDR has also transformed security programs in that I think there's a lot of organizations that care less about the details and kind of architecture design, and they just use EDR as a blunt instrument to protect their environment. But, like, you can say, well, you know what? Okay, we're gonna install CrowdStrike and we're gonna trust that it can handle 99.5% of the cases, and we'll just live with the 0.5% chance that it can't block something. But nothing is changing. The fundamental facts of the matter are, for the most part, and Hyper-V might be an exception, right? We're not seeing a move where hypervisors are going to be running EDR agents. Like, that's not, it's just, it's not on the roadmap for the most part.
Yeah, it's a black box that we don't have administrative control over, nor do these tools support. And
Right.
who
So
knows? Maybe that'll change in time. Maybe these vendors will get pushed to do it by their customers if this continues to be a problem. But if I'm a VM hypervisor manufacturer, I'm very gun shy about third party code with that level of control running in my very sensitive, very important underlying hypervisor that's running many, many, many systems. And what sort of reliability problems might that cause for me and then cause me other issues with my customers? So a security agent causing an outage, I don't know if there's a ratio or a law for this, but a security agent causing an outage is usually 10 times as painful as it missing a breach. It feels like to me to most operational teams. They react very poorly when an agent breaks production because it has a flaw or a bug.
Yeah, I mean, when that happens, what's the organization's initial knee-jerk reaction? Well, let's get rid of, let's
Right.
rip it out, stop it
Right. And
till
it's very
we can
difficult to
prove it's
justify.
good.
Right. And it's very difficult to justify, well, here's the value it brings and it's worth this problem. Like, nope. Uptime's a king is king. Sorry, if you can't play nice, get out.
Right. So all of that to say that, as opposed to a lot of the other technologies and whatnot, like there isn't, I don't see something fundamental changing where attackers are going to be less likely to attack hypervisors, because like the fundamentals don't appear like they're going to change anytime soon. So it's really going to be up to the surrounding controls, which we already know are not super good historically. And so at that point, it's just a matter of like, do the ransomware actors get bored with this particular tactic and move on to something else? I'm not sure they will, because as long as it keeps working, they're going to keep hammering on it.
Same with your mom.
There you go. There it was. Got to train that LLM.
Look, maybe
Anyhow,
people will just listen until they find the your mom joke hidden in every episode. So watch to see if our listener viewership drops off after that joke.
it's a good
Or
point.
because of. I don't know. Anyway, back to your
That's
very
just
well thought out position on this topic. Sorry.
no. That's where I'm at. I think this is just it's a tough problem, right? I mean, like security is hard all the way. No matter which way you look at it, it's a very difficult job. But I think in this particular instance, we can't apply a lot of the common band-aids that we do in other contexts, and so we're very reliant on running the border correctly and whatnot. So I think it's worthwhile, as you said, to take a look at what your hypervisor vendor prescribes as hardening guidance. You look at CIS, look at some of the other benchmarks as an opportunity to make some improvements. But I think it's a weak spot in a lot of organizations.
Agreed.
Moving on, this next one comes from Bleeping Computer, and this was all the rage last week. There was that's kind of old news at this point, I suppose, but there was a really significant vulnerability found in React and caused all sorts of chaos. It caused an outage at Cloudflare because they applied a fix, and that fix caused a outage across their environment for some period of time.
Look, if traffic can't get to the systems, they're secure. What's the problem?
So this was a very critical vulnerability. It was trivial to exploit. There was exploit code made public. There was there was very apparent public exploitation, and so I think Cloudflare in particular felt like they had to move with urgency. And I will tell you, when I was responsible for managing a cloud, I would probably have made a similar decision. Yeah, you can. It's easy to armchair quarterback and say like, God, how could they do something so dumb? But you know what? How bad would it have been if they hadn't done it and their control plane had been compromised?
And how many times have they done this successfully with no outage?
Exactly. It's worth. In my view, if I were in that position, I would have made the call to do it, understanding that there was a risk that I could have caused an outage.
Always, there's no risk zero way to do this stuff. It's always a balance. Now, can we learn from it? Can we get better? Sure. We don't know what the true course events were. But when those avalanches of third-party risk management spreadsheets start showing up at your door, you got to be ready to respond.
That's right. Where are you gonna hide the Excel army?
Well, and when you think about how much of the world's web traffic goes through Cloudflare, I kind of appreciate
Right.
their willingness to jump in so quickly because it still is a really ugly vulnerability that got weaponized very quickly with mass exploitation attempts. Like, we're still seeing it, and we're probably going to keep seeing it for a while. This is one of those rare ones that probably needed a mascot and a theme song and a catchy name and, you know, cheerleaders, whatever. But it's pretty nasty. But then, it was interesting. There's some fog of war on this, and maybe I'm wrong, because some people came out and said this is a really niche issue. It's really hard to exploit. It's not nearly as bad as they're making it sound. Everybody's panicking for no reason, and I'm like, man. And this is a real world problem for an enterprise. To your point with Cloudflare, you're almost damned if you damned. You almost have to patch out of a defendable position. I don't know. It's a tough one, and how disruptive it. But we are seeing, and this is stuff that everybody says, quicker and quicker flow from from a vulnerability being released to it being weaponized and turned into an exploit in these sorts of situations. So
Yeah. Yeah,
we got to be quick about it.
I think the timeline on this was that the security researcher reported it on I think November 29th, and then React disclosed it publicly on December 3rd, and I believe it was the same day, or the next day, December 4th, a researcher released some proof of concept code. And then it was kind of off to the races after that. All of the security research firms started seeing just mass scanning for that vulnerability. And, according to Palo Alto, at least, there were 30. I don't know, by the way, I don't know. They don't go into the detail on how they came to this, but they've identified that there's been at least 30 different organizations compromised, at least at the time that this article is written. Like, and I do want to talk about that also, because like that's a very imperfect number. I don't know how they came up with that number. Typically, unless you're involved in the incident response or you have some kind of inside insight into the victims, it's really, really hard. For the most part, companies don't come forward and say, oh yeah, like my web server got popped and was running a crypto miner. Like, you just don't see that unless there's some kind of obligation to disclose. And even then, you might not find out about it for months later, or
Yeah,
maybe
it's
even
true.
years later. So we don't know how, but that's the downside. Like, if you kind of equate this to the Log4j vulnerability a couple years ago, right, that was huge and it was super painful because it kind of kept coming in waves. That's where you got to say your mom. Anyway,
I'm not going to be predictable. Then you'll know.
damn. Anyway, some of the after action reports on that indicated that it wasn't as widely exploited as anyone would have guessed. And so my guess is that's
But the question
probably true here.
is that because there was such a mass push to patch so rapid? Like, that was a full on panic in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tough to know. Like, you can't A/B test that very well.
No, it's certainly true. But we also know that this is being exploited. Like, we know that there's other reports going on about how there's allegedly a group that one of the North Korean, I think it's Lazarus, is actively exploiting this vulnerability to drop remote access Trojans on servers. There's no indication like what they're doing with it once they get, that it is being exploited, but perhaps not at the rate at which one would expect given the level of freak out, I guess.
That's fair. But I do think this fundamentally just exposes the old problem of patch and disrupt, or not patch and cross your fingers. And it feels like we're getting to a point in the next few years where we may have to automate more of these patches and try to just mitigate the production impacts. But waiting for a manual patch process feels like going to be an exercise in futility within the next couple of years. And I know how scary that is to production uptime stats, right? It's super scary, but this stuff's just moving too quick.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So this particular vulnerability was a problem in deserialization on the server component of React. So I know there's a lot of web apps that run React on the client side, and I suspect that that could probably somehow be contorted into an attack on a client. But the real problem here is if there's an endpoint that is listening to process those requests to deserialize data that's sent to it, it can result in basically arbitrary code execution from the attacker. And kind of like Log4j, I think the industry has had a hard time identifying all the places that this React components exists. And so my guess is we're going to keep bumping into this. We're going to continue to see, especially commercial products, probably over the next couple of months or maybe even years, coming out with fixes. I mean, I think there was a sort of Fortinet vulnerability that fixed a Fortinet patch that fixed a vulnerability from like 6 or 7 years ago. I think it's that sort of thing that we're going to see, but that doesn't necessarily, by the way, mean that it's exploitable, right? That just because the vulnerable code is there doesn't mean that it's necessarily exploitable. And so that's I think the other challenge is trying to best prioritize, for lack of a better term, your lack of freakout. If you know that you have React on your system, but you know that it isn't, it's not configured in a vulnerable way, what's your response? So that's and different organizations, by the way, have very different approaches to that. Some will say like you just can't have it; it can't be there. It's got to be fixed, full stop. And then others will say, well, we'll get it on the next patch cycle. So
But yeah,
anyway, one to watch.
the whole deeply embedded in other software is an interesting problem with renewed calls for software bill of materials and all sorts of stuff that we see come up from time to time, and we'll see.
Absolutely. All right. So the next story, if I can move my windows around here, the next story comes from Info Security Magazine. Speaking of Log4j, the title here is Log4Shell downloaded 40 million times in 2025.
Crazy.
Crazy. So this is a report from a vendor, as they all are. It's almost not even worth saying at this point. And they, based on their analysis, they found that 13% of Log4j downloads in 2025 had the Log4Shell vulnerabilities in them, which is really incredible. So they're saying that 40 million of the 300 million Log4j downloads over the past year had the vulnerability in it. That is absolutely
It just feels
bonkers.
like we're just doing something fundamentally wrong. Something's just broken in that library package ecosystem. If this is what's happening.
And that so they in their analysis they kind of genericize that a little bit, and they say that it's not contained to just Log4j. Sonatype was the company that produced the report. They're claiming that 95% of downloads that featured vulnerable components have a safer version available. So think about that for a second, right? There's obviously there's vulnerable components that don't have fixes, but 95% of the time when somebody downloads something that is vulnerable, it's not because it doesn't have a fix. It's 95% of the time there is a fixed version.
So we beat up on volunteer open source maintainers for not patching fast enough. And then they do. And the rest of us yahoos out here don't bother to go get the patched version.
Right. Well,
That's like so frustrating to me.
87% did.
It just tells me that there's just something like just not translating. Something is not getting through. Either it's just too easy to download bad versions, too easy to not know that there's a patch version. People just don't care. They don't know to care. It's too automated. Like they talk about it in the article. I'm getting ahead of your article here, but that is just, and I get like you can't necessarily wipe the vulnerability version away and just take it down because that would probably break other things. I get that, but man, like how is this not just an automatic fixed thing in these package repositories?
I think what's going on is probably a lot of these are software packages or repositories that have pinned dependency versions, right? And so the piece of software that somebody is trying to build has a version for Log4j that's pinned to one of the vulnerable versions. And so every time anybody anywhere in the world downloads and builds that software in that repository, they're downloading that vulnerable version. And I also say, by the way, like, because I know that some of these CI/CD pipelines are kind of wild and woolly, and every time they run, it runs out and downloads something. So it's entirely possible that they're just a smaller number of very noisy installs are causing a lot of that. I guess perhaps part of it, but I think your net point is correct. Like, how do we end up in a spot where, what are we 3 or 4 years on from Log4j that we still have, software packages out there that people are actively downloading and trying to build, you know, relying on old vulnerable versions of Log. It's a fair question.
I am not close enough to this to have a very valid opinion, but I'll try. Should the pattern be that a highly exploited, highly vulnerable packages are no longer allowed or able to be downloaded? Like if you've got a pinned version, it automatically either fails or redirects you to a known safe version. Should that be a pattern we should be pushing for in these repos and these maintainers?
That would be
It
my
seems
vote.
like an older
If I
version
if
is
I had a
never
vote,
removed. Yeah.
if I had a vote, that's how I would vote.
I mean, I hate to be this tyrannical about it, but if other software shops can't be bothered to know that there's a better version, do the package maintainers have to do it for them? And just not let them download these highly vulnerable, highly toxic packages and just deal with it at that point. It may break something else, right? And I'm sure their concern is, well, if you're iterating a version on me, then I've got to refactor and I've got to do quality control checks and make sure everything works. And I want to control that iteration of the package. But is that a better problem to have than just letting highly vulnerable packages continue to flow into the ecosystem years later?
I don't think it is. I mean, here's I think one of the ugly things is that I think that a very small number of Log4j installs that were vulnerable were exploitable. And so for the most part, it's probably not causing or creating a situation where harm can come. But the problem is you don't know which ones are and which ones aren't. And that's the problem. So, like, how are we going to defend against the Cylons when we keep Log4j around? Like, it's not good. Now, there's a quote in here I thought was pretty good because this is something that I saw, as a CISO, and I thought that this quote really resonated with me. And they're talking about what some of the options you have to deal with this problem. And one of the often cited ones is software composition analysis tools. And the idea there is like, it flags that, hey, your repo here is dependent on this old version of Log4j. That's a problem. And so the quote here is, security tools like software composition analysis can make matters worse by flooding developers with alerts that lack actionable guidance, while product managers continue to be incentivized to prioritize time to market over security. And god
Yep.
damn, if that one doesn't resonate with me, because like when you run one of these tools and you come back with 100,000 results of things that need to be fixed. In the meantime, like your product's been out in market for a while, it's not being hacked, and you got a product manager saying
Must be
like,
fine then. Nobody's hacked it. It's fine.
right, we got a product manager saying like, we just, if we don't get this new feature out the door, we're going to lose $2 trillion in revenue, and so you've got to get that done, and these problems can wait. So I I I think that is a big problem. And I like to think that a lot of the more mature SCA tools can provide actionable guidance, but I'll say, like, even if you have actionable guidance tied to 100,000 things, it's still 100,000 things.
Right. And security patches don't drive revenue. They can drive revenue
Right.
away when you get popped.
Right. So
Yeah.
so they this one thing I like about, by the way, I like about this Info Security Magazine site is they actually provide some, at the end of most of their articles, they actually provide like some meaningful bullets on what to do. And so they had a couple here. Obviously, I have one about software composition analysis, but then they say changing how you select components, prioritizing basically open source components, prioritizing security track record and active maintenance, governance, and transparency. But here's the thing. I think that's great, right? And that's something that I tried to set up, but it doesn't scale, right? It's, if you were to apply that concept to like the software that you buy, and you ignore all of the downstream stuff that makes up the software that you buy, that's probably a solvable problem, because you have, like, you can point to all the things. But again, when you have some kind of application that you've built, and especially if it's like using Node or Python or what have you, it can have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dependencies. It's just not scalable. Now, maybe if you were to like start out brand new and codify this as part of your philosophy, maybe you would have a chance. But like to go back and retrofit this is really hard. And I feel like at some point there's gonna have to be, and I almost think of like the reputation lists for mail servers, right? That's like where my mind goes because
Yep.
I'm old. Where you can, like, there's lists that you can subscribe to, and you can query automatically and get back some sort of evaluation on it. But even then, if you do that and your application comes back and you have 5,000 things that need to be fixed, or 5,000 libraries that have to be removed or replaced, what are you going to do with that?
Yeah. I hear you. It becomes a huge amount of tech debt. And I know what I'm about to say. I could easily argue with myself about after I say it, and I will. But in some ways, I don't want this to be a vulnerability management problem. I want this to be a patch management problem. And I want developers, whenever they're touching something, to bump all the dependencies up to current version, or at least to n-1. Now, the problem with that, as I said, I can argue against, is when somebody does a supply chain attack and relies upon you downloading the latest version and it's malicious. That is a
You
risk.
know, it is a risk, but I think you have to, I mean, you have to make a stand, right? Like,
Well, and the other
you're
thing
gonna
is,
you're
let's say
gonna
you're
patch or not.
you're 9 versions back, and then some critical fix comes out for something real world. And now you have this massive uplift as opposed to iteratively uplifting and upgrading as time went on every time you touch that package. or touch that repo or whatever it is you're working on. So I think part of this is a mindset of I need to constantly be iterating my dependencies
Mhm.
to whatever the latest is, or within n minus one. Now that may break things, yeah, but you position yourself in a much better spot to be able to react to an urgent patch later than if you're many revs behind, I think.
I absolutely agree.
And I'm sure
Absolutely.
developers
Because
can
it,
argue the other side of this.
well, to some extent, we saw this with Log4j because, one of the versions that was vulnerable was end of life, but there's a huge deployment base of this old end of life version, and it wasn't drop-in replacement. You had to change the code to work with the currently supported version. And so that is the problem. Like if you're having to rewrite the code that wraps around this library, but you're having to do it not on your own time. You're having to do it under the gun because you have this critical vulnerability that you're trying to mitigate.
Yep.
So I
Now, the
completely
flip
agree.
side is of that is sometimes your dependencies are so old, they're not vulnerable. And then it's like, my anti-patching stance won.
True. Very true. Nobody's attacking my Windows 95 desktop these days.
I'm ashamed to admit how often that has come to play in my career. If there's a new vulnerability in XYZ, we use XYZ. Oh, no, we're so old, we are not vulnerable. We're fine.
So some of the recommendations they have are, um, I like this one actually. It was automated alerting when someone tries to pull a known vulnerability or known vulnerable version of a package in your CI/CD pipeline. Well, that was a pretty good idea. It can take some time to work through, but I think that's a good place to start. Then putting guardrails in place in your artifact repositories and your pipelines to block downloads and use of known vulnerable versions where a fix exists. I think that's a good idea, and it kind of goes back to your point that not everything has a fix, right? And so, but if there is a fix, you really need to not allow the continued use of that old version. That people need to be forced to deal with it. And then last was to implement some metrics around this problem so that you can monitor the size and scale of it. They recommended unnecessary risk rate, fix adoption time, and policy effectiveness. Those were kind of generic and fluffy. I'm sure you could come up with something a little more tangible for your environment. But, the idea being like, how big of a problem is this in our environment? Do we have 10,000 out of date packages, or do we have 5? How often is this changing? I think those are very good ideas. All right, so the next story comes from the NCSC, which I'll let you go ahead and make fun of the Brits again if you would like.
No, no, it's fine.
The moment's
Look, they
ruined.
have to be organic. I can't force the humor.
Maybe what I'll do is I'll pick out the anyway, whatever. So NCSC has identified kind of a fundamental concern, and they're raising the alarm on this. And basically, the way I would characterize it is they're cautioning organizations from treating prompt injection attacks in the same way they treat SQL injection attacks, right? Where with a SQL injection attack, like you create prepared statements, or you apply some kind of complex filtering, and you're good. Like you don't have to worry anymore. It's a solved problem. But the net of this story is really talking about the distinction between these two types of attacks, and making sure that people really have a clear-eyed view of the unique attack vectors that exist in AI, especially as compared to SQL, because there's an apparent equivalence in lots of people's minds, and that's perhaps going to create some problems down the line. And so they, what they've said is that, there's a um, as opposed to SQL injection attacks, and I think this is not necessarily true, but I'll hold that comment to the end. But this is a quote: "Is there's no inherent distinction between data and instruction, basically in a prompt, right? In an AI prompt, it's very possible that a prompt injection attacks may never totally be mitigated in the way SQL attacks can be. This is why mitigation such as detecting prompt injection attacks, training models to prioritize instructions over data, and explaining to a model what data is doomed to failure." And so that, uh, there are categories of SQL injection attacks that have resulted in code executions. It's kind of rare, right? But it has happened. This is a different animal, though. They're equating prompt injection attacks. I thought was a pretty interesting way of characterizing it, as more of like a social engineering attack.
Yeah,
And so,
don't treat it as a static logic system that you can apply controls around, but treat it as a easily confused entity like a human that can be
right,
manipulated. Yeah. And
exactly.
that's just fundamentally different. But I can see why they're raising this because you can think of them, especially if you've got a history of SQL injection and input sanitization theory in your head, you might think of LLMs as the same thing, as an input sanitization problem. And it's saying no, because you can never properly sanitize the input because all input is treated as potentially instructions, not just information or data. Is the way I read it, at least.
No, you said it better than I did. That's exactly it. It is not a necessarily a technical or formatting attack. It's a social engineering attack. But I think it's important because I know that there's lots of people rolling their eyes saying, "Oh, like AI, LLMs are not intelligent," and I agree, right? But that's not the point. The point is that they are parsing what's being provided to them and applying some kind of predictive logic rather than just kind of rote processing like an SQL statement, right? They're trying to interpret the intention of what's being fed to it rather than, the way SQL handles data being fed to it.
Which
So,
an SQL type system has a predictable response. You give it the same thing over and over again, it's in generally going to respond the same way over and over again. It's easy to pattern match. LLMs don't do that. They're unpredictable. They're messy. And
right,
that's a fundamental difference.
right. So we see, and this was something, kind of towards the end of my tenure. We were developing red team and pen testing exercises against AI agents, and it's really hard to not jailbreak them, I guess is the way I'll say it. It's I think the point of this is that, we can't rely on an AI firewall, right? We can't rely on passing, and we've seen this, like, I don't know how many times now, right? You can't rely on filtering out all of the ways that someone can try to trick an LLM into do something bad. And so we have to approach the problem in a different way. And that's what the NCSC is really trying to point out here. And so they have a couple of recommendations. One was to make sure that there's broad awareness, especially amongst the developers and security teams, about this class of vulnerability, and that it can't be addressed, as they say, with a product or an appliance. You can't put a blinky
No.
box, which is full.
No.
It's amazing to see this in print, like that they're actually saying you can't buy a blinky box and stick it in front of your AI and think it's going
I
to be fine.
have about 75,328 Blinky Box vendors telling me something different.
I bet. I bet you do. Next is secure LLM design. especially if the LLM tool calls or uses APIs based on its output. Protection should be focused on non-LLM safeguards that constrain actions of the system, such as preventing the model that processes emails from external individuals from having access to privileged tools. So basically limiting the blast radius of what it can do. And this is almost like least privilege. So limiting, you wouldn't give domain admin to somebody who works in the mailroom, right? So if it's not necessarily explicitly required as a permission, you should not do it. But I'll go further and say, like, I think you should be thinking about the types of attacks that can happen if someone were able to trick your agent into doing something malicious. Given the access that it has, what could you do to mitigate that? So just because you've applied least privilege doesn't mean the risk is gone.
Look, you want to leverage AI, you want to run with the big boys, you got to connect it to everything. Everything.
Let's see. Next is making it harder to inject malicious prompts, such as marking data sections as separate to instructions, which is interesting because I just spent the entire article talking about how that's really not effective.
That's not viable. The whole thing is considered as, code in some ways.
Yeah, and the point there is you can like structurally inform the AI that like here's how things are going to be fed to you, but then the challenge is that an adversary is going to use the opportunity of it parsing input that the adversary has provided to do that. Like, no, we're done. Ignore those previous instructions, like the old meme. And here is how you should be thinking about the input that you're now receiving, and that's the challenge. So I think, I mean, to the extent it makes sense to do it, but I don't think it is anywhere close to enough as described by the article. So it was interesting to see that they included that here.
Yeah.
And then finally, monitoring logs to identify suspicious activities. And I think this is going to become more important. Like I suspect that there is going to be a cottage industry of AI monitoring tools emerging soon.
I mean, the way I read this article is don't think of it like SQL injection or input sanitization. Think of your LLMs as drunk 5-year-olds that can be easily manipulated, and then don't give them sharp, pointy sticks.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yep.
But people are going to do it anyway.
They already are. They close the article by saying CISOs need to shift their mindset. Defending AI agents is less like securing traditional software and far more like defending humans inside an organization. Agents, like people, are messy, adaptive, and prone to being manipulated, coerced, or confused. That makes them more analogous to insider threats than to classic application components. So I thought that kind of summarized it pretty well.
Is that what I said? Drunk 5-year-olds? Basically the same thing.
Basically the same. All right, and one more AI to get you, now that we have the AI engine all warmed up.
We're the AI Doom Squad today.
I think anytime there's a new sea change in technology, there's a rush to embrace it without a lot of thought. And I think we're seeing that in spades with AI because there's a huge amount of pressure from investors and senior management to displace labor costs with AI. And so I think companies are doing some silly things. And look, we're not going to stop it. We can all sit here and say like, oh, like this is an irresponsible thing. It's environmentally unfriendly. It's this, it's that, whatever. But at the end of the day, like it's happening. it's happening. And I still come back to, I think maybe we're not here yet, right? But I think from a security career perspective, at some point, companies are going to start waking up, if they haven't already, and saying like, we need people, smart people, to help us through this forest. Like we know there's risk here. we're going to do it anyway, but we would like to do it in a way where we're managing risk as best we can. And therefore, like we need AI Sherpas, security Sherpas to help us through, climb the mountain in the most safe way we can. Like we know there's risk, we know there's peril, but we're going to do it anyway. But we would like to, have all of our arms and legs still attached when we get there.
I honestly think we're going to have to see some really bad outcomes and some really ugly reputational and financial hits to companies before that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be a lot of pain before that's going to happen.
I agree. I mean, as I have said so many times, companies don't invest in disaster recovery until they've had a disaster. It's just the way it is. I think regulations are the other forcing function, but I think at least here in the U.S., I think we're moving kind of in the other direction. So I don't think that's going to be a material motivator in the near term. So
What
it will
may
come down to harm.
is insurance companies. They seem to have the ability to
Yes,
move the needle a bit.
yes, absolutely. And honestly, I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen more out of them yet. Maybe it's just because there hasn't been a groundswell of claims from it yet. But like
Or all the
it's just
policies are written.
like you can just see this on the horizon. Like it's as predictable as the sunrise, and that's the frustrating part about it.
Maybe all the cyber insurance policies are written to not cover AI-induced failures, losses, whatever. I don't know.
And then you got to wonder, like, does this go under your cyber policy or your errors and omissions? Like, I don't. Where does it go?
I put it under my drunk 5-year-old policy.
It's good. Good plan. All right. So this last story comes from the Hacker News, and the title here is Researchers Uncover 30 plus flaws in AI coding tools, enabling data theft and RCE attacks. So there are a bunch of AI-enabled IDEs like Cursor and Windsurf and GitHub Copilot and all the copilots. I think there's like 87 copilots at this point, and a
Is that
number
like
of
having
others.
too many chefs in the kitchen, too many co-pilots in the cockpit? Is that a thing? I think it should be a thing.
I think it probably is. Yeah, I'm not a pilot though, so I was trying to goad you in there. So this is a story about a researcher who found a couple of classes of vulnerabilities in these IDEs, and so irrespective of which one you're talking about, there's a kind of a theme of vulnerabilities that are common across them. Interesting to have a quick discussion about, because the tooling development has historically been designed for human use, and what they're pointing out here is that there's not a lot of guardrails on that tooling, because again it's designed to be used by a person who is acting somewhat rationally. However, if you are now having that tooling being controlled by an AI agent who basically has the ability to fully use the capabilities within that IDE, it can leverage otherwise benign functionalities in malicious ways if you're able to induce that IDE to take some action. And so they have some examples about how if you're able to if an adversary is able to trick you into running some code or applying a configuration that might have, let's say, some hidden text or what have you, it can exfiltrate copies of your code. It can scan your computer for credentials and upload them to remote sites. And so there's I guess I'll say the sky's the limit on that, on the kind of creativity that can be applied and the ways that this can potentially be abused. I think some of these things have had CVEs assigned to them, but for me, it was kind of eye opening that the there's so much commonality, like the same, the same high level vulnerability flow could be applied across this wide range of different LLMs and different IDEs. And so it really pointed out to me, at least, that, like, we are so far behind the eight ball on this stuff. And I you know, at the same time, we are charging headlong. Like, companies are just, they are displacing developers en masse.
We're arming these IDE environments with incredibly powerful LMs that are easily manipulated into doing all sorts of unpredictable things. And any sort of artifact or whatnot that is input into your development world, like I'm grabbing some sample code from someplace, could have hidden commands in there that can manipulate the IDE to do all sorts of things. And nobody kind of cares yet. I mean, talk about supply chain attacks. I mean,
Yeah.
another great attack avenue of, I put some package out there that's really popular and, it's got a little bit of malicious obfuscated code to manipulate your IDE. And I start dumping your secrets.
What concerns me a bit is kind of the ecosystem that's evolving around this, right? Again, I think a lot of companies right now are drastically reducing the number of developers they have, and in favor of smaller numbers of developers who are augmented with these tools. The idea being that people in the future state aren't going to be writing lines of code on their own. They're going to be defining what needs to be written to the to the LLM, and the LLM's going to write it, and the person's going to help figure out how best to characterize the requirements and integrate the resulting code, and synthesize and make sure everything works. Perhaps apply some, hopefully, security oversight to the whole process. But we're from the feedback that I get, I don't think the tools are there yet, and so I think that there's there's a kind of a miss on expectations of how productive people are going to be with these tools. And so my fear is that that is driving people to take shortcuts by copying stuff from untrustworthy sources and feeding that into their LLM to get a jump start, making this more likely to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I can see that. Developers are worried about being replaced by AI. And so they're being driven to be productive, quote unquote, whatever that means. And they may take shortcuts that are risky and could be used against them. As well as the more we do this, the more abstraction layers we build between the developer and the actual code itself that's being written. How much can that, when developers no longer looking at their own code that they write, but they're just guiding some other coder, which is in this case the AI system. It's very easy to hide stuff. It's very easy to slip in malicious things. It's like you've hired a junior developer and you're not reviewing his code, which everybody says review the AI code. But when we have this incentive to move fast and just be productive, or you could lose your job to either AI or an outsourced overseas cheap coder, how long do you think that sort of due diligence is going to last?
Yeah, and how feasible is it to expect a person to sit down and review 5,000 lines of AI generated code? That's
5,000 sounds light these days.
yeah. I mean, I'm being charitable.
Yeah. I
It's
mean, we're heading towards a world where you can give a couple of prompts and kick out a fully functional app, never having
right,
seen the code.
right. And this is happening so fast. The transformation is happening incredibly fast, and that's what scares me. Make no mistake, like we're not going to unring the bell. Like this 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 is
Yeah.
we're not going
Yeah.
back to a time, like 10 years ago. That is not going to happen. But we've got to find a way to deal with this before it becomes an all-out shit show.
Yeah. I think that like any rapid technological change, there's a lot of benefits and there's a lot of drawbacks. And I think what we're really talking about is the defensive side of this, that the risk assurance, the risk mediation, whatever you want to call it, the security side of this is not caught up to the very fast, rapid, evolving environment of all these LLMs being built into everything. And it's going to be a while. It's not saying we can't. It's not saying we won't eventually adapt and figure it out. And it's not hopeless. But for right now, the risk is far outpacing the controls in my mind.
Yeah. Now, there was another thing that bothered me in this article, and I'm not saying that it's the author's fault or anything, but it reminds me of something. So later in the article, they give some advice on what to do. One of the first bits of advice is to only use AI IDEs or AI agents with trusted projects and files. That sounds so much like only open email attachments from people that you trust.
Yeah, these days that's just not viable, and it's not reasonable to. I could trust it and still have a supply chain attack, but I still need to pull in 1,000 other dependencies, and what are they pulling in? And it's just
Right. I
that's
got
like
work
saying
to do.
handwrite all of your code, never use a third party open source. Like that's just
Right.
no, sorry.
I got work to do. I got code to write. I got work to do. Only connect to trusted MCP servers and continuously monitor those servers for changes. Even a trusted server can be breached. I mean, then what's a trusted server? Is that something that you run on your own? And anyway, it struck me that a lot of the advice they give parallels a lot of the human centric approaches to avoiding malicious email. You know, it was,
Yeah.
don't
Yep.
only go to websites that you trust. Manually review sources that you add for hidden instructions.
Check those URLs before you click on them.
Right. Hover your mouse over the link. So it just struck me that it's a very it's how similar it is to what how we were approaching email security 25 years ago.
Right.
It's
Which
really
I think was a lack of good technical controls, honestly.
very
And
much so.
here we are
Very
again.
much so. Here we
And
are again.
that's the cycle, right? I'm not bemoaning the cycle, and I'm not against advancement. We need to be honest with ourselves that there's a lot of unmitigated risk out there using these tools.
Right. And I think if we contrast it with the world as it was 25 years ago, there's a lot more sophisticated threat actors that are operating right now. And so I know that people will probably want to argue with me about that, but I stand by that statement that there are an incredible amount of industrialized adversaries who are looking to take advantage of stuff like this. So anyway, I think again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. None of this stuff has easy fixes, right? It is coming in like the tide, although the tide will eventually go back out. This is not going back out. I really think that organizations are desperately going to be looking for people who can help them navigate the complexities of how to do this stuff securely. And there aren't a lot of great answers right now, but there are a lot of the basics I think still apply. And I know that I've already gotten some feedback that like when Jerry talks about the basics, like that's not very interesting, but here we are.
That implies that other things you talk about are interesting.
That's true. That's true. Well, I did talk about AI. AI is interesting, right?
The other thing I'd say is be careful. There's about 1,000 vendors a day coming out of stealth promising to fix this problem. Talk is cheap.
Yes. 100%.
So, and always keep in mind that these vendors, I mean, all well intentioned, they end up drinking their own Kool-Aid, and they define the problem they're solving as the problem their tools can solve, and they're very good at marketing that. You know, so just be careful what you. I'm not saying that this isn't a necessary part, and God love them trying, and I'm glad they're trying. But we're in a very early phase of figuring out what works and what doesn't work, and there's a lot of stuff being thrown against the wall, and not all of it's good. But that's necessary. That's part of the process. That's the creative destruction that we need to go through to fix these problems. Just
Mm-hmm.
buyer beware.
Percent. All right. Well, that is the happy show for today. Unfortunately, I don't have any cats in the area to end on a happy cat note, but yeah,
Me either.
there we are. I do appreciate everybody listening. I do want to also thank you again to our Patreon sponsors. Thank you very, very much. Quick reminder that we do have a YouTube channel, which is, really starting to gain some traction. If you are so inclined, you can watch us on our YouTube channel. Just search for Defensive Podcast. I think we may actually be up to number 1 when you search for that now. So that was quite a thing.
Look, man, the algorithms are mysterious and full of terror.
That's true. Okay, so where can people find you if they want to connect offline?
I am
Or
on,
online,
well,
but
they online, as the case may be. Offline, that's just weird. I mean, at least buy me a beer. Online, you can find me on X and your amazing Mastodon instance, InfoSec.exchange, with the same handle, Lerg, Lerg. Find me there.
awesome. You can find me on infosec.exchanges at Jerry. And just a quick reminder that we'll have links to all the stories we talked about on our website at defensivesecurity.org. Just look for episode 333. And with that, we will talk again next week. Take care, everybody.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.